Well, after a somewhat tame episode last week that proved to be a bit divisive in terms of its reception, this episode got the show back on track and gave us everything that we've loved watching unfold in the 6 episodes so far. The humour, the story, the deeper meaning behind it all, and the strong performances by not only Tom Hollander but the wider cast. Focusing on age, being forgotten, and going out of style, let's jump into the video and break down and explain all that there was to take away from this week's inclusion. Here is FEUD Capote vs. the Swans, Episode 6, Ending Explained.
What, honey?
I said, is the book shaping up as you'd hoped?
Not at all, and I couldn't be happier.
Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. After watching this episode, it was clear to see what it was focused on. It was centered around trying to hold on to your youth, feeling the effects of age and not being in touch with what's popular, whilst also mourning a life that you once had. Something that can never come back. We saw this most through Truman, but we even saw the effects of it with Babe and CZ, showing that time was something that was catching up with them all. This was most present when right at the start of the episode, the hat store that Truman and the Swans would often shop in was on the cusp of closing down because nobody wanted to buy hats anymore, solely because they'd gone out of style. Another occasion was when Truman was getting Kate ready for her photo shoot. He dressed her in a way that he thought was stylish and popular, essentially just like Babe, when in reality, times had changed, and the stark contrast in styles that Kate had at the beginning when Truman dressed her to the point where she had her photos taken was so different. This mood was also captured when Babe and CZ were looking to buy some gloves. However, the glove department had been replaced due to them not being as popular as what they once were, and the store priding itself in keeping up with current fashion trends. So the Swans and Truman were kinda going out of style, something which, as we heard in the previous episode, was the very thing that they feared most. Not being able to hold on to their youth and doing all that they can to stay as current as possible. This was also the case with Truman, where he said how when he looked at his hands he noticed liver spots, and then when he compared his hands to Rick's, he said that they were full of lines compared to the smoothness of Rick's. And also when Rick was trying to get Truman to sing the song, which was the big song at the time, he didn't know it at all, showing just how detached he was from what was popular and how he'd almost fallen behind to age. Movement is youth was a prominent line that was spoken by Dickie when he unbabified Kate and got her to dance in front of the camera for her photo shoot. And that was something that Truman took literally, as he then went to Studio 54 and got captured on photo and printed in the newspaper dancing, almost being made a laughingstock of because he was viewed as too old to be going out and doing that, showing just how much he wanted to hold on to being young. I also felt like the relationship with Rick was something that kind of embodied that too. John was slightly younger than Truman, but Rick, well, he was quite a lot younger, and we saw that Truman almost pounced on him and hoped that by being with somebody younger, it would in turn allow him to feel it. But that wasn't the case at all. Rick ended up leaving, and whilst there was a sense of Rick using Truman for a good time and a bit of money, Truman himself even said he's leaving earlier than he thought he would, but he stayed longer than anticipated, showing that he knew that it was never going to be something that was serious. There was a moment in the episode too where Truman said, "Well, it's finally happened. I've gone out of style." This was the line which really summed up the mood and feel of the episode to me. Truman felt young inside, but his exterior was aging and he wasn't as up to date with the trends as what he once was. Is that because of the bottle that he constantly ends up turning to? Is it because he's not with the Swans anymore and is kind of in this no man's land position in high society where he's there but the world just spins around him? Or is it just because that's what happens to all of us? As Truman said, when you're in your time, you attract people towards your light, and for him, his light is dimming, and what's left of it is only lighting up the corner of the room and not the center anymore. So people aren't necessarily gravitating towards it, and it's now easier for him to be forgotten. Truman's drinking and the distractions that were in place was something which also took center stage in the episode. Everybody would ask him how he was getting on with the book, from the surgeon to Dickie to Kate to CZ, everybody. But he was just getting distracted by the booze and relying on it to get by to justify that distraction. Kate saw just how much the bottle was impacting him, and he said how there was a sweet spot between 3 and 3.5 drinks that he liked to be in before going on live TV, something that he was doing instead of writing. He viewed himself more as a personality rather than a writer now, hence why he was doing all of the TV appearances. One of these appearances led him to saying something about Gore Vidal, which meant that he was facing a lawsuit. Lee should have been able to back up his story, which would have meant that the lawsuit would have been dropped, but she refused to do so. We saw a real homophobic side to Lee in this episode, something which almost showed the bitchiness and the two-faced nature that was present, and almost how some of the gay men of the time were viewed differently, almost used as an accessory to these high society women, and then when they needed help from the people that they thought were their friends, like in this situation, they were left out there to fend for themselves. Truman being on these talk shows was something which also had a focus at the end where CZ was watching him and he sounded extremely intoxicated whilst being interviewed, and then as she was watching it she started to cry. I feel that happened because she seems to be one of the only people that care about Truman, and she knows how the drink is slowly killing him. The final line in this episode was just marvelous. It was Truman reflecting on age and how he's lost his friends over time. This was married up with clips of him with the Swans where there were happy times at places that no longer exist, like the hat shop. This showed that he'd now moved on from that time and it was a place that he knew he could only ever visit inside of his mind. There was a line in this episode which was, "Finish your book and you'll live forever." What's kind of haunting about this is that Truman never actually finished Answered Prayers and it was published after his death. So when you see these distractions being depicted on screen, it does hold weight to it, because the distractions prevented him from ever finishing the book that he spent so much time wanting to write. Overall review. I actually really enjoyed this episode of the show. I thought it was so much better than last week. I thought episode 5 was the worst in the season and the worst by a long way, so having an episode of this standard back brought the show back to where it needed to be as it hit the final stretch onto the finale. I liked the main story in this episode, focusing on age, going out of style, and not being able to keep up with what's relevant, when once upon a time the Swans and Truman embodied that relevance and almost contributed to what was popular. The shot where Kate walked in, where there were all of the eyes that were staring at her, it felt like they were almost just glaring and trying to suck some of the youth out of her. For me, Tom Hollander is just stealing the show, and I feel he was the perfect casting choice. He just makes me laugh with the smallest of lines that he says, and they're delivered in the most comical, animated, but natural of ways. A lot of its perfection is mastered in the delivery, but I have to also praise the writing, because without the witty lines being on paper, it just wouldn't work. He plays the role so well, and it's the thing I look forward to most before going into the episode, knowing that we're going to be getting a great performance by Hollander. I think seeing as though we're almost at the season finale, 2 more episodes to go, I'd say it's definitely been a mixed bag of a season. I'm not going to cast my final judgment just yet because there's still a bit of time to go. But I would say that it's been inconsistent in quality. I think the first 4 episodes were really good. It felt original in style, original in its storytelling approach and the subject matters, but I'd say these past 2 episodes were a slight dip in quality. With the next episode being focused on Babe, I feel it could be centered around her death and maybe how Capote handles that, something which could make for some great performances and moments, so I'm intrigued to see what's going to happen there. The show feels very Ryan Murphy. He has a distinct style, whether that be in the way that his shows look, the casting choices, and the slightly darker tone that everything just seems to have. I'm a fan of his work, so it's a great base to always fall back on. I did enjoy this episode and it was definitely better than last week. I just hope that the next 2 in the build up to the end go on to be the best in the season. So, there you have it. Feud Capote vs. the Swans episode 6 ending explained. If you want to see more videos on Capote vs. the Swans, then click on the card in the top corner. I've broken down the episodes and I'll be continuing to do that until the season finale in 2 weeks' time, so be sure to come back in the next couple of weeks for more breakdowns. Thanks for watching the video, it means a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.